Welcome back, everybody. So I'm not sure if this is the most serious video I've ever made or the least serious video I've ever made, because today's topic is Jordan Peterson, the former professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, where I did my PhD. And this one has been a long time coming. And with his most recent Twitter meltdown over body shaming a model on the cover of a recent Sports Illustrated magazine, and after a lot of pressure from my mentor, actually, to make this video, I have capitulated. Here I am, going to tell you what I think about this person. But before I get into some details, I just want to sort of note at the outset that there's a kind of paradox of engagement. If you're watching this, you probably know, not the biggest fan. I don't think Jordan Peterson is the public intellectual we need right now, but he is the public intellectual we deserve. And that's a poor reflection on us. Okay. And so what I'm calling the paradox of engagement is that he has become ridiculous. And perhaps he always was. And that's a reason why academic researchers, serious people, tend not to engage with him too much, because he's not really that coherent. And he's not a trained expert in most of the things that he publicly opines about, especially philosophy. And he got big at U of T basically by proselytizing in a very patronizing way to undergraduates. And he's very, very good at it. And I'll say more about the other things I think he's very good at in this video. But the problem with academics not taking him seriously is that people who actually know what they're talking about, but are maybe not as qualified as public speakers and rhetoricians, they don't want to engage with this person. And therefore, the people that do engage with him are often not as smart as he is. And he is an excellent public speaker. And the import of his ideas, however superficial to the specialist, have communicated to a very large section of society, which means that public engagement, public ideas, just like democratic elections, are themselves a function of raw social democratic consensus. And over the past several years, he has become important. He went away for a while, now he's sort of back, and I'm hoping he will just go away. But until he does, this will be my one video on the subject, and I will attempt to say something about why I don't think he's worth any more than that. One point about his intellectual depth, and by way of offering an apology or an argument on behalf of those academics who don't think he's worth their time, because he isn't. He had a public debate with Slavoj Žižek a while ago, where he spent a good chunk of his opening remarks attempting to deconstruct the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. And he literally had a copy of the text up at the podium, and he was reading through it and trying to explain why he thought Marxism was all wrong. And you know, this is a very scholarly thing to do in a public debate. Look, I've got the book here, and we're going to read it line by line. Here's the problem with that, right? Going to the Communist Manifesto for a mature rendering of Marx's political philosophy and philosophy of economics is a category mistake. It is literally a manifesto. What that means is that the purpose of the document is to inspire the proletariat to overthrow their oppressors. It is not a mature philosophical treatise. And if you want that, go read the 3 volumes of Capital, right, that he wrote. That's the main thing that you need to look at if you want to understand Marx's mature philosophical views. So there's this sort of performance of the public intellectual and the passion of a public intellectual, but the chops just aren't there. And that's why serious scholars really struggle with him, I think, in terms of getting engaged. And I'm going to say why I think that's a mistake near the end. But the question I want to dwell on here right now is a diagnostic question, a genealogical question, which is that what makes him so popular? Some people think he's the most important public intellectual alive. And other people think he is literally incoherent and unstable. That is quite a range of opinion. And to have that many people have that strong an opinion about him, and for those opinions to be so widely divergent, speaks, at least on a psychological level, if not on a rational level, to him doing something right. And I use that word very, very tentatively, to mean if your goal is to get the attention of many people and to have your ideas listened to by many, many people in a public domain, he has clearly done something right. What is that? Here's what I think is going on. I think there are 4 connected pieces. 4. Maybe there's more, but these are the ones that I think are the most important. Okay, so the first one is that he has a particular way of talking about scientific data that gives him an air of objective truth. He likes to cite certain studies and to avert to interpretations of evolutionary biology and neuroscience and psychology and population statistics in a way that gives what he's saying the force of scientific objectivity, which is itself a construct that needs to be, critically analyzed, but he uses it, and he uses it well, in the sense that he commands your attention when he cites these kinds of sources. But then he pairs it with another domain, which is arguably even more important, which is what I'm going to call a certain kind of religious meaning. And here he really channels his neo-Jungian archetypical style as a psychologist. He likes to talk about archetypes and big concepts like chaos and order. And when you give psychologically robust concepts like that a kind of rich religious spiritual meaning, you're then marrying 2 very powerful forms of discourse into a single narrative: the discourse of scientific objectivity and the discourse of religious meaning. When you have those 2 married together, and then you argue that what we should be doing is preserving the status quo, that's a very powerful argument, right? Because his point is, it's okay, angry young 22-year-old white man. It's not your fault. It's those pesky feminists and queers. They're the ones trying to take away your freedom. When you take that kind of status quo preservation message and you marry it to the objectivity of science and the emotional power of religious meaning filtered through the categories of a psychology that's already kind of in the public domain, Jungian archetypes, and then you put it in the mouth of someone who is an exceptionally gifted public speaker and who believes what he is saying, that's a powerful combination. That's what makes him so popular. And then when he writes his public books, here are the rules. Obey these rules. If you obey these rules, you will have order against chaos. It's a truncated narrative, but a powerful one when people are feeling inundated with information, stressed out by moral demands that they don't fully understand. This is a very powerful narrative. And I am, in that way, not surprised that it has been so popular in the public consciousness. Now, what I want to do now, with that sort of preliminary diagnosis of the popularity in place, is offer some criticisms of his thinking. And to be fair, I'm not sure I have much to add. There's been a lot of that out there, and a lot of it's good. But one question I want to ask, and this is a rhetorical question, and I always tell my students, don't put arguments in the forms of rhetorical questions. So I'm about to break my own rule. But here's the question. In this world that we're living in now, how could your main worry about the fabric of democracy being torn apart be with queers and feminists? There's like a neo-fascist renaissance, and you're worried about non-binary pronouns? That's where you think the war for freedom is happening? I just don't get it. It just seems silly to me. And if you're so worried about gender roles, why? And you think that the reason to be worried is that we're somehow disrupting the natural order. I think there's a tension here. Okay, so here's a form of argument. Here's a form of argument that Peterson really likes to do. I've seen him do this. It's hard to track him down because there's so many YouTube videos that it's like a career just to watch them all. And I just don't recommend that anyone do it ever. But here's a form of argument he likes to say. He says, look, if you go to Scandinavia, you will see there in the socialist governments some of the most extreme laws ever enacted in human societies to like equalize the playing field for gender. And yet, with all those laws in place, we still see that women disproportionately self-select into prototypically feminine career paths. Okay. Therefore, there is a kind of bioessentialist gender psychology at work that motivates our choices and that is at the root of how men and women behave, and we should like build a society that respects those boundaries. Okay, so that's one form of argument. Then on the other side, and this is what made him famous, he's getting super upset about enacting these laws in Canada. There was a law a few years ago that was introduced to introduce gender expression and gender identity into the Code of Human Rights, right, in Canada. And he's like, we shouldn't do this. That's compelled speech. You can't force people to use certain types of pronouns to refer to other people. That was roughly the argument. But here's why that doesn't work. Either gender roles are encoded into the fabric of life itself and are therefore not subject to the influence of culture, or in which case, stop worrying. Or gender isn't an immutable part of our biological form of life, in which case, as rational self-law-giving beings, we can change our nature by enacting norms that shift how we've lived. One of the problems is you can't have it both ways, right? Either these gender roles are stitched into the fabric of life itself and are therefore not going to be changed by any of the laws you enact. That's the point of the Scandinavian argument, right? Like, look, we've done all these laws over here and it's still the same. That means you have nothing to worry about. Or you have something to worry about because human beings are changeable, in which case you need some other argument that isn't grounded in the biological to anchor your gender essentialism, which isn't forthcoming. Because almost all of his arguments are grounded in looking at the animal kingdom and saying, look, we should behave as lobsters behave. This leads to my second concern. Looking to the animal kingdom for clues about how to behave as a human being. This is just what philosophers call a naturalistic fallacy. And it's also cherry picking, right? So it's a naturalistic fallacy in the sense that we should try as best as we can to temper deriving ought claims. Women ought to do these things. Men ought to do those things from existence claims about how nature is. It's also worth noting that if evolution is true, which it is, no nature in the domain of life is immutable. That's the law of evolution. Gradual, slow change is the law, which means there is no immutable nature, human or otherwise. Are we going to eat our babies? Because lots of animals do that. Does that seem like a good guide to our behavior? I don't think so. So you're always cherry picking when you look at nature, especially when it comes to gender roles. So there are 3 different animal species that I want to point out right now. Certain species of higher apes, elephants, and lions, all matriarchal societies. Okay, they're all matriarchal societies. My favorite example here is the lion, because in our culture, the image of the lion is of this very proud, strong man, king of the jungle. And yet, when we actually observe lions in nature, their entire society is run by the females. And in fact, male lions are the worst pieces of shit in the history of animals. The only things they do is show up after the women have killed the prey, feed, impregnate the women, and sometimes kill the young. And then they leave. And the women, the female lions, raise the young, do all the hunting. Okay? Why is this relevant? Because nature is profligate with diversity. And looking at nature and thinking that you are going to see behavior patterns in animals that are reliable guides to what a rational agent who can give itself moral laws should do is A, category mistake, and B, even if you find some behavior that you like, you are locking yourself into a hermeneutical circle. You are making choices about what parts of nature to attend to and what parts of nature to ignore in constructing your narrative about how humans should behave. And then you import onto the narrative the authority of science and biology. And then you interpret the way that biology should ramify in human life according to quasi-religious psychological categories. And you build for yourself a self-encasing, self-enclosing, self-perpetuating narrative that preserves the status quo. And I really believe that this is the place where philosophers and psychologists who know better, who are better educated, who are more careful and nuanced in their thinking, have failed the public. Because the public is intelligent enough to hear sophisticated ideas argued for carefully. We might prefer simplified ideas belted loudly into a microphone confidently by someone who believes what they're saying, because it's entertainment and it suits a certain emotional need that we have. But if philosophers and psychologists who know better don't fill the gap between our dedicated, rigorous research and our attempt to communicate those ideas in a way that is visceral, that is existential, that matters to people who don't have the training, if we don't fill that gap consciously, charlatans like Peterson will. And that's why I started this YouTube channel, to do a small part that whatever I can, to try and fill that gap. Because as I mentioned at the outset, Peterson is the public intellectual we deserve, but he's not the public intellectual we need. When this all first blew up years ago, I was still a PhD student at the University of Toronto studying philosophy. And I wrote an essay about it at the time because it was stressing me out. And I've linked that essay below in the little bubble below this video. So if you want to read something a bit more engaged and technical, though hopefully not alienating, take a look at that link. And I think I'll conclude my thoughts there, and I look forward to the responses. All right, good luck, everybody. Take care.